Here I have one of our VBS costumes we use every year in the VBS dramas. It's a great way to tell the story that we talked about in the sermon from Joshua chapter 7. Achan, one of the Israelites, who was a part of the group that went into Jericho to take over the city by the powerful hand of God, took a cloak or a robe, maybe something like this, and some gold and some silver for himself and hid it in his tent. God had been very specific with instructions about what the people were to do with those devoted things. They were to destroy things like this, and they were to put some of the gold in the Lord's treasury. God didn't want anything that belonged to that pagan nation, that pagan city, that pagan culture, that ungodly culture. He didn't want anything to influence His people. And so He said, you need to get rid of it. You need to destroy it. You need to keep your distance from it. But Achan sinned, and he chose to take some of those things for himself, and he hid them in his tent. And we learned, and we know this in our own lives, that sin doesn't just impact the one who sins. Sin impacts others as well, the whole community. That was the case in the story, not just for Achan's direct family who had to pay the price, but for all of Israel. They went into the next battle, and they lost the battle because of their sin, specifically Achan's sin, had separated them from God. God's provision and protection was no longer over them in that battle. His sin impacted the whole community. The same thing is true for us. Now, we don't really talk about devoted things these days, but there are things in our lives that parallel this robe or this cloak, those devoted things. Things that we need to keep at a distance, things that influence us in an ungodly way. Maybe relationships, friendships, maybe things that we do, temptation, sin. There are things that defile us that God says you need to destroy, you need to get rid of, you need to keep a distance from them. There are other things that maybe in and of themselves aren't sinful or aren't bad, but we need to devote those things to God, because if we don't, they can get a hold of us and pull us away from God. Things like money and possessions and jobs and so many things in this world that aren't bad in and of themselves, but when we keep them for ourselves, then they become something that gets in the way of our walk with Christ, those devoted things. And the nature of those devoted things is if we don't destroy them, they will destroy us. Sin does that. Sin will destroy our relationships. Sin will destroy our families. Sin will destroy sometimes our physical health, our emotional well-being. Sin has an impact on us and on others around us. We certainly see that in the story of Achan from Joshua 7. But we see that in our own lives as well. There are consequences for sin. In many ways, our story parallels Achan's story. Sure, the circumstances are different. We're probably not going into cities and taking VBS costumes or cloaks or robes. Hopefully we're not taking gold or silver, but we sin. We give in to the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. We sin, and our sin separates us from God. And so in many ways, our story does parallel Achan's story. But here's where our stories go different directions. Achan and his family had to face judgment for their sin. We read in the Bible that the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. Certainly, Achan's story personifies that great truth. The wages he paid for his sin was death. Our sin deserves death. But again, here's where our stories go different directions. Because of Jesus, Jesus steps in and takes our death for us. In many ways, the story in Joshua 7 is not just a historical event. It is a foreshadowing of the need of the gospel, of the incarnation, of Jesus putting on flesh and living among us and dying for us. If this outfit, this robe, if this represents those devoted things, those things that we do that we shouldn't do, that sin, those things that we should keep at a distance or devote to God, if that's what this represents, then imagine Jesus coming along and saying, "Here, let me wear that for you. Let me take that from you." And you say, Jesus, wait, the wages of sin is death. If you take this, that means you're going to die. And Jesus says, I know, and I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to carry that burden for you. I'm willing to take the judgment that you deserve because of your sin and take it from you and bear it for you. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we have been healed. Isaiah 53. Jesus takes that death for us. Obviously, in this story in Joshua 7, there are some of the major theological themes that we need to discuss, and I hope you will discuss in your time together. Themes such as God's justice, his judgment, his wrath, his mercy, his kindness, salvation, and how do you reconcile all of those seemingly contradictory aspects of God and God's will? We try so hard to get our mind around who God is and how he functions. Spend some time wrestling with those big themes that you see in this story. Jesus comes along and he takes our sin for us, and he dies that death for us. He faces that judgment on our behalf. And I don't want to carry the metaphor too far, but we also read in the New Testament that when we put our faith in Jesus, we are clothed with Christ. Galatians 3:27. When we are baptized into Christ, we are clothed with Christ. And so we put on that garment with Jesus. And remember, we said this garment that he took from us represents death. And when we are clothed with Christ, we too die. Not a spiritual death that is separation from God, because Jesus took that for us, but we die to self. We are crucified in our selfish nature so that we don't desire to sin. We don't want to take the devoted things. We want to devote them to God and distance ourselves from anything that might destroy us spiritually. So we are clothed with Christ, sharing in his sufferings, sharing in his death, but also sharing in his glory. That's the gospel. That's the good news. And so don't forget, as you talk about justice and judgment and wrath, to talk about the rest of the story. Redemption and salvation and good news. Talk about those important things in your time together. And I guess I better go put this costume back up before Miss Brenda comes looking for me.